mentioned Pushkin, and so now I think it's fair that we have to mention Dostoevsky as well. Notes from the Underground comes to mind here. That idea of where we live, in the darkness, under the ground, subterranean. So often we live in a kind of hopeless despair. And he says, who wants to really live that way? And then he comes back to the question again. Will a veiled sister, he asks, pray for children at the gate? Now this is an interesting word picture. Some have seen this as the gates of heaven, looking in, wanting to be there, but not able to commit. That inability to commit. We think of our study of Kierkegaard here, don't we? That inability to take that leap of faith, that ability to jump, right? Children at the gate, who will not go away and cannot pray. Now, I think there's a lot of different word pictures going on here. Let me just throw two at you. One of them is, you'll remember the lines, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. In other words, from Holloman. In other words, there's things we want, but we're just not sure we can commit to doing it, right? Then there's the myth of Daedalus Icarus. The father telling the son, don't fly too close to that sun. The son, unfortunately, not actually able to hear. The child, the youth, right? The children at the gate who will not go away and cannot pray. And then we're back to the prayer again. For those who chose and oppose. That notion, I mean, it's an interesting idea, because the minute you choose, you have made a choice. To not choose is to make a choice. So the question isn't, will you choose? The question isn't, will you believe? The question is, what you will believe. And beyond that, can you live that belief? It seems to me that is Eliot's greatest question of this poem. And then he comes back to it. Oh, my people, what have I done unto thee? One more time. It is the question, of course, of all questions of the poem. Will the veiled sister between the slender yew trees, back to the tree of the graveyards, pray for those who offend her and are terrified, again, this dread idea, and cannot surrender and affirm before the world. This is exactly why Eliot wrote this poem. He wants to surrender and affirm, it is true, I have converted to Christian communion. That, of course, would lead a large number of people to completely write off all of his poetry, including Wasteland, once he took this kind of a position, and deny between the rocks, again, Scylla and Charybdis, in the last desert, before the last blue rocks. The desert in the garden in the desert. It's a brilliant line. I mean, think about it. As Jordan Peterson has pointed out in his classic lectures on the book of Genesis, there's the known, there's the unknown. And of course, the known is everything that we know really well. It isn't actually a cell phone for you. It's just a tool. It only becomes a cell phone when it stops working. It isn't really a truck for you. It's just a tool. It only becomes a truck when the engine doesn't turn over. And then you're like, oh, great, what am I going to do now? That is true of That's true of our smartphones. That's true of our trucks. That's also true of civilization. It isn't civilization. It's a tool. It's just what we use until it stops working. And the minute it stops working, we go, oh, dude, what's going on? At that point, it becomes civilization. Why? Because it moves from the known to the unknown. The challenge, and I think this is the language of this poem, is to live close enough to the edge so that we're in our known, but we're approaching our unknown, as Vygotsky talked about it in that notion of the zone of proximal development and cognitive disequilibrium, the idea that you kind of move out a little bit into the unknown territory and you kind of find your way. There is the desert in the garden. There is the garden in the desert. Obviously, we're thinking of Milton and Eden here as well, but this notion that sometimes even in the garden, there's desert there, all right? I mean, you can be in a really good place, and then all of a sudden you're not in a really good place the minute, for example, that your tool becomes something other than a tool, and it becomes some foreign object, some unknown object to you. Notice the desert in the garden in the desert of drought, spitting from the mouth the withered apple seed. Of course, Genesis 3 comes to mind, but I think our Milton here has to as well come to mind. And the question of theodicy. Why does bad stuff have to happen? No longer ask, why is it happening to me? You can't see yourself as simply a victim in a world where all this bad stuff happens to you. Who wants to live that way? And besides that, there's never an answer to the question, why did this happen to me? Ever. No matter what answer you come up with, there's always another question. But the moment you change the 2 to the 4, Why did this happen for me? You can now begin to gain some control of your life. You can say, it's not that I want bad things to happen. It's not that I want suffering, but I know I can learn something through this, and that makes me somehow better. The apple seed. Of course, the eating of the apple produced the knowledge of good and evil. The obvious question is, good thing or bad thing? We're back to our Blake, of course, songs of innocence, songs of experience. Of drought spitting from the mouth the withered apple seed, and then one more time from Micah 6:3 to finish. Oh, my people. To some degrees, of course, then it's always the challenge of forgetting. Forgetting the things that really matter. What really matters? This is what Thoreau meant when he said, I went to the woods deliberately to front only the essential facts. And not to come, he says later, when I came to die, to discover that I had not lived. Living is too dear, Whitman says in that part, in that chapter 2, right, of why I went to the woods. That idea where I lived and what I lived for, right? That idea that we've got to find something. We must learn, Thoreau will say, to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an expectation of the dawn that will not forsake us in our soundest sleep. He says it, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. Well, that conscious endeavor, what is that? To remember, to wake up, to remember. What is it that, now 3B question already, what is it that you need? What is it that you need to remember? Well, again, at 2A, the only sin obviously is to forget. The only salvation is also to forget. It's just a question of what you forget, right, and what you remember. At 2B, well, we're playing around with the word words here. Obviously, the word can be the Bible. It can also be, of course, Christ incarnate if you're thinking in Christian theology. But just think about all the different ways that words work within our culture. N-O-T, K-N-O-T. We play the game all the time in 303, right? At 3A, I mentioned the Daedalus Icarus myth, obviously the Micah 6:3 passage. I want to mention here Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which we've not mentioned. I've given a lecture on this. You can find that one as well at Learn Strong. I think that's an important, a very influential word picture for T.S. Eliot all the way through this poem. That idea that we're always traveling. The question is traveling from where to where, right? Finally, at 3B. What was a time, and we asked this question before in our study of Icarus Daedalus, what was a time that you refused to listen? And it probably did hurt you. I mean, we don't like to write about it maybe, but it's a truism. That there's probably some people that are trying to talk to us a little bit. Maybe we just didn't want to listen to them because they were old and what do they know, right? All right, we now turn to part 6. This is the last section. You guys have been amazing to sit through such a long lecture and such a long and detailed poem. I hope that it's challenged you in some ways to think about your own existence and the choices that you've made or not made, or the choices that you will make or not make, the stories that you accept or the stories that you reject. Notice the opening word. We move from because at the beginning of the poem to cannot to finally although. Again, the fallibilist position is in play here. Let's go ahead and say and look at it again. Although I do not hope to turn again. He says, I hope I can stay on this journey that I am taking. It's going to be an awfully hard one. Let's finish now the poem out.
Although I do not hope to turn again, although I do not hope to turn, wavering between the profit and the loss in this brief transit where the dreams cross, the dream-crossed twilight between birth and dying. Bless me, Father, though I do not wish to wish these things, from the wide window toward the granite shore, the white sails still fly seaward, seaward flying on broken wings. And the lost heart stiffens and rejoices in the lost lilac and the lost sea voices, and the weak spirit quickens to rebel for the bent goldenrod, and the lost sea smell quickens to recover the cry of quail, and the whirling plover and the blind eye creates the empty forms between the ivory gates, and smell renews the salt savor of the sandy earth. This is the time of tension between dying and birth, the place of solitude where three dreams cross between blue rocks. But when the voice is shaken from the yew tree, drift away, let the other yew be shaken and reply, Blessed Sister, Holy Mother, Spirit of the fountain, Spirit of the garden, suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood, teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still even among these rocks, our peace in his will, and even among these rocks, Sister, Mother, and Spirit of the river, Spirit of the sea, suffer me not to be separated, and let my cry come unto thee.
Now let's go ahead and go to work now with this last section. It is a really beautifully poetic way. Can we say it out loud? It's like a prayer or a request, right? As we now will finish our time together with this poem. Although he says, I do not hope to turn again. It's his goal that he will stay consistent. That is to say, sustained will. It isn't enough as an athlete, is it, to say I will train. It's not enough to train. You got to keep doing it, right? I mean, students who, for example, the 100 days of summer will often say, I'm going to train every day, and then for 2 weeks, and then they, that's his challenge here. Although, notice the repetition 3 times, although I do not hope to turn, and then this interesting verb, wavering, right? An imbalance, maybe, movement between the prophet and the lost. We have to think about our wasteland and the Phoenician sailor, right? In this brief transit. That's what he sees. That's what it is. It's a transit. It's a journey, but it's a brief journey. I mean, we think about Walter Raleigh's What is Our Life? A play of passion, our mirth, the music of division, our mother's wombs, the tiring houses be, where we are set for this brief comedy, right? This idea that we are here for such a brief time. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all yesterdays of life waste the fools to dusty death. Macbeth will say in Act 5 of that play, right? This brief transit where the dreams cross. Now, you could say that the word dream has been here all the time in this poem. And dream as in goal, dream as in illusion, it plays on so many levels. The dreams cross, the dream crossed twilight between birth and dying. We haven't mentioned much of our Nietzsche in this lecture, but Twilight of the Gods comes to mind. The God is dead, passing from man. Man comes to mind here with this idea of the twilight between birth and dying. Hey, notice that we'll sometimes say it as birth and dying, and then we'll sometimes invert it from dying to birth, right? Bless me, Father, is the parenthetic that will be a part of the prayer within the liturgy. Though I do not wish to wish these things from the wide window. And of course, this poem has all been about perspective, looking through the window, the wide window towards the granite shore. Now we're going to play games with this granite shore when we meet it again in 4 quartets, especially in Dry Salvages. His poem about rivers and seas. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. Later he will say the earth is a land's edge also, the granite into which it reaches, the beaches where it tosses its hints of earlier other creation. The granite shore, the white sails. Now for those of you that love your Pete Jackson's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, and you like that final scene at the conclusion of Return of the King with the boat and the white sails, here you go, this is the imagery. The white sails still fly seaward, flying, unbroken wings. We're back to the eagle symbolism again. Of course, biblically, you've got Psalm 103:5 or Isaiah 40:31 or Keats's Elgin Marbles, as we've mentioned before. And of course, the phoenix bird as well comes to mind. And the lost, notice the use of the word lost here several times. The lost heart stiffens and rejoices in the lost lilac and the lost sea voices. Now, when we hear lost, we have to think about our paradise lost. But as we've said many times in 303, this word picture is a compelling one. A 6th grader talking to a 3rd grader, the 3rd grader is doing just horrific math problem. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. The 6th grader says, no. You don't know hard math. That is not hard math. The third grader can't believe it. Of course, the sixth grader doing sixth grade math problems will have the ninth grader say, no, 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 no. This is not hard math. Wait till you're in ninth grade, sixth grader. And of course, the sixth grader can't believe it. The ninth grader is saying, this is the hardest math. I cannot imagine it ever get any more difficult. And the senior, of course, will say, wait, there's this thing called calculus coming. If that's true of our math study, is that not also true of our life's living? Which is to say, there's always more challenges coming, right? We know that. So that when we meet that, we shouldn't be shocked by that. There's always more math coming. There's always more life challenges coming. So that, notice, the heart will stiffen, but also rejoice. The lost lilacs here, of course, will take us back again to wasteland. The lost sea voices, the sea has many voices, many gods and many voices. The salt is on the briar rose, the fog is in the fir trees, he will say in Dry Salvages. The American of the four poems, the more American of the four quartets. You'll hear about it as you follow our lecture. And the weak spirit, notice here the word spirit repeated, quickens to rebel for the bent golden rod, and the lost sea smell quickens to recover. The cry of quail, we've got bird messages here, and the whirling plover. You're going to put this in your notes. You're going to see a lot about birds as well in four quartets. Eliot loves to use them for symbolism and the like. And the blind eye creates the empty forms. We can't help but think about Republic, of course, and form theory of Republic 6 and 7. Between the ivory gates, we're back to these gates that the children were looking through, but somehow unable to want to go through. And the smell renews the salt savor of the sandy earth. Can you hear those S-hard sibilant sounds? This is the time of tension between dying and birth. Notice how we'll reverse the order from earlier in the poem, from birth to dying. Of course, your yin-yang symbol comes to mind here in the poetry of Blake and Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. We've given several lectures on both Taoism as well as Blake on learnstrong.net. We will play around with these reversals as well in East Coker Part 3. When we get there, you'll see what I'm talking about. The place of solitude. Now that's the goal, right, in some ways. Well-being is what the American philosopher Sam Harris will call it, well-being. Solitude, where three dreams cross. Now what are these three dreams? Well, let's say it out loud. We've been messing with threes all the way through this thing, right? Repetitions of although at three. I mean, we got threes all the way through. We blame a lot of that, of course, on our Euclid and our Plato and obviously our Augustine. What are these three dreams? Some have qualified it as past, present, future, right? Between the blue rocks, we're back to the wasteland. When the voices shaken from the yew tree drift away. The yew tree, again, being an important symbol of this poem. And then this next line, which for some of my students is their favorite line of the whole poem. Let the other you, Y-E-W, be shaken and reply. But of course, there's any number. I mean, Eliot knows exactly what he's doing here. When he reads this out loud, if you don't have the poem in front of you, you could read it as let the other Y-O-U be shaken and reply. And of course, it works both ways. It's brilliant, right? In other words, why do we read this stuff? Oh, what is the point? So that you can be shaken, and then you can reply. Of course, reply only if you're shaken. And of course, you're only going to be shaken if you're like the young man at the concluding of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Another story about a bird, an albatross that gets jacked. Go back and look at that lecture that we've given. Remember, a wiser and a sadder man, he rose the morrow morn. Why? Because he identified with the old man's story. But notice, not everyone, is going to hear that old man's story. And even of those who hear it, only a few will ever actually hear it. We're back to Plato's Republic, the opening lines, how can we hear if we refuse to listen? You've got to be shaken to reply. And if this poem works at all for you, that's why it works for you. It shakes you, and then you're forced to reply. Okay, you know what you don't want. You've got that list. Fine, whatever that is. Now what do you want? Say it. Out loud, say it. And then, of course, finally, how are you going to get there? How will you finally get there? That's the question, of course, of all questions. We're back to the Blessed Sister now to finish this poem. poem, which is in some ways a prayer, Holy Mother, of course, the Virgin Mary being here referenced. Spirit of the fountain, Spirit of the garden, suffer us. And here the word suffer, of course, carries double meaning, right? It can mean suffer as in pain. It can also mean suffer as in allow. Suffer us to mock ourselves with falsehood. Truth is the key. As we have said many times, these texts are all teaching us one thing. Got to tell the truth. Because there is no lying to others. We never lie to others. We never cheat others. We only cheat and lie to ourselves. Right? That's the ontological insight of this poem, right? Suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. And then again, the repetition of the original line, teach us to care and not to care. That notion from the Bhagavad Gita, as we've talked about it before, to recognize yourself in all being and all being in yourself. We're all connected in some way. So we have to care. But we can't care so much that we're somehow distracted from actually doing good in this world. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still, still and still moving into another intensity is the lines that you'll hear from East Coker. Old men ought to be explorers is the setup to that one. Even, notice the word even here, among these rocks. In other words, Eliot has come to realize you can live in the wasteland and be in that world, but not of that world. You can be a light to that world. The great Nelson Mandela said it many times, that while he was sitting in that cage waiting for his emancipation, he was praying for the emancipation of all others. Whoa! Now that's a pretty amazing spiritual place to be, and yet I think it's echoed here in this notion, right? Even among these rocks, our peace in his will, this is Dante language, and even among these rocks, Sister Mother, and the spirit of the river, we think about dry salvages, and of course the river that Eliot knew because he was raised in New Orleans, in St. Louis, the Mississippi River, right? The spirit of the sea, suffer, again he uses it, it's an Old English allowance or permission word, not to be separated. And let my cry come unto thee, Psalm 102 comes to mind here. This is the postmodern condition, this separation, this disequilibration, this dislocation, right? Well, in many ways,